in a sine function of the form y equals a sine b of theta, a is the amplitude of the function, and b is the number of cycles in the interval from 0 to 2 pi. And the period is going to be 2 pi divided by b. So if I'm going to draw a sine function right here, this is my x-axis, y-axis. The generic function y equals sine of x has an amplitude of 1 because there's a 1 in front of here. So I'm going to make the function go up by 1 and then down by 1. And the period is 2 pi because b is 1, so there's one cycle that from 0 to 2 pi. So I'm just going to show you what y equals sine of x looks like. So on a unit circle you have 1, 0, 0, 1, and 0, negative 1, and negative 1, 0. So remember, sine of x is the y coordinate. So if I'm going to mark up and go up, this is 0, this is pi over 2, this is pi, this is 3 pi over 2, and this is 2 pi, 360 degrees. So if I go up by pi over 2's, this is pi over 2, this is pi, this is 3 pi over 2, and this is 2 pi. So when you have sine of 0, the y coordinate is 0, so it's going to start right here. If you do the sine of pi over 2, the y coordinate is 1. If you do the sine of pi, the y coordinate is 0. And the sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1. And the sine of 2 pi is 0. It makes this curvy wave that looks like this. And it extends this way too. So what I try to do when I'm graphing any sine function is I want to get 4 points. I want to get the 2 or 3 x-intercepts, and it's going to go up, down, through the x-intercept to the bottom, or to the minimum, and back up to the x-intercept. So it starts at the middle and goes maximum, x-intercept, minimum, x-intercept. That's the pattern. So down here I'm going to find the amplitude and period of each sine function and then use that to write an equation. So the equation is going to be of the form y equals a sine of bx, where b is the number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi. So first I'm going to look at my amplitude here, and I'm going from negative 4 to 4, so my amplitude is 4. And if I take 2 corresponding parts, my period is 2 pi. So this means that 2 pi divided by b is the period. That was our equation for the period. So that means that our period is 2 pi, so 2 pi divided by b equals 2 pi. So if I solve for b, b must be equal to 1. So my equation is y equals a, which is 4 sine of x. And then number 2, I'm going to look at my amplitude. So my amplitude looks like I'm going up from negative 1.5 to 1.5. So my amplitude is, you can either do 1.5 or I'm going to just do 3 pi over 2, or 3 over 2. So my amplitude is 3/2 or 1.5, either way. And if I look at my period from here to here starts a new cycle. So if this is pi, this right here is pi over 2. So there's a cycle every pi over 2. So I set 2 pi over b equals pi over 2. And I solve for b. So to solve for b, I multiply both sides by b to get it out of the denominator. And then I'm going to divide both sides by or I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 over pi to get rid of this part. So times 2 over pi. So these pi's cancel out, and I'm left with b equals 4. So my function's going to be y equals a, which is 3/2, sine of b, which is 4x. And then over here, number 3, the amplitude is going from -2 to 2. So it's going to be a is 2, and my b and the period is 2 pi divided by b equals the period. So the period is going from here to here, so that's 3 pi. So this is equal to 3 pi. Now I'm going to solve for b, multiply both sides by b. So these cancel out. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 3 pi. These two cancel out. So I'll get b equals 2/3. So my equation is going to be y equals a, which is 2 sine of 2/3 x is my function. Okay, so what I did was to graph these functions, sketch one cycle of the sine curve. So what I want to do is I first take my period, which is pi, and I mark that off on the x-axis, pi. Then I cut pi into 4 spots. So I cut it in half to make pi over 2. Then I cut that in half to make pi over 4, and I took the distance between here and here, and it was 3 pi over 4. So you want to get 4 points right here to graph your sine curve. Then I marked off the amplitude, and I went up 2 units, down 2 units. So the sine follows a pattern of start at 0 or your initials part, go up to the max, go back to the initial, go to the minimum, back to the initial. So when I look at it, I almost feel like this makes a backwards upside down S for sine. That's how I remember it. And then the pattern continues. So down here, my period was 2 pi. So I marked off, I went to 2 pi over here, and then I took 2 pi and I cut it into fourths. So half of 2 pi is pi, half of pi is pi over 2, and in between here is 3 pi over 2. And then I marked my amplitude of 3 and -3. So sine starts at 0, and it goes 0, max, 0, min, 0. That's if it's starting at 0. So if it's going to, in a couple sections, it's going to not start at 0. It could be shifted up or down. So in that case, starting, max, starting, min, starting point. So starting, max, then back to 0, then min, then back to 0. And you can keep going on with this function too if I had a better scale. So this one, whenever we want to sketch a cycle, one cycle means one period. So first I'm going to find the amplitude, which is 2, and then my b is 1. So 2 pi divided by 1 is a period. So 2 pi is a period. So I have my or my vertical line. This I'm going to let be 2. This be -2. So remember, you take your period, 2 pi, mark it. So I'm going to mark my 2 pi right here. I just wanted to go up by an even number amount since it's 2 pi, so I went up by 8. Then I'm going to cut the 2 pi into 4 pieces, because you always want to cut it into 4 pieces. So I cut it in half and get pi, cut pi in half and get pi over 2, cut this in half and get 3 pi over 2. So sine starts at 0, and it goes up to the max, back to the start, or 0, down to the min, back to the start, and curvy. So that's one cycle. Okay, then 14, A is -2. Okay, so this is the first time that we have a negative number. So this negative number means it's going to be reflected. So if I look at this previous example, instead of going up, down, up, it's going to start right here and go down, all the way up, down. So I still need to find my B, or my period. So it's 2 pi divided by B. So my period is pi over 2, 1/2 pi. So I make my x and y axis, and I take my period, which is pi over 2. So I'm going to go up by, I'm going to take pi over 2 and cut it into fourths. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is pi over 2. So half of pi over 2 is pi over 4. Half of that is pi over 8. And in between here is 3 pi's over 8. So I start at 0. Now this is going to go down. This is going to go from -2 to 2. So I'm going to go down because this is a negative. So I go down to the min, back to the 0, up to the max, and back to the initial. So it's still looking like an S, but the other S went this way because this is a negative. And then the last one, A is 1, B, the period is 2 pi over 2, so the period is pi. So I make my X, my vertical, my horizontal, and I need to go up to pi. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's going to be pi. Half of pi is pi over 2. Half of that is pi over 4. Half of over here is 3 pi over 4. And then I start at 0. Here's going to be my 1. And here's -1. So I went up by 3 for a scale. So there's nothing in here that's negative, so I'm going to go up to the max, down to the 0, down to the min, back to the original, and it makes an S.